Who have you met or known that ended up being dangerous or committing a major crime? Please do like, share, and subscribe. Donald Traub, Willow Grove, Pennsylvania. He used to babysit my little sister, and I'd go over to his apartment and borrow movies and such. He was randomly shooting people at this point. He finally murdered some lady in a supermarket parking lot. I'll never forget. My mom was scared about the shootings because she rode the bus to work, and people at bus stops were shot at, and she was talking to Donald about this, and he goes, "Oh, Kathy, I don't think you have anything to worry about." Crazy. I'm just glad he liked me and my family, I guess. My family used to rent out half of our house when I was a child. My dad always thought the couple he rented to were creepy, but they paid rent on time, so they stayed. Apparently, I even used to think I was related to him. Child logic said he was in our house, so he was family, and go up and hug him, which bothered my dad a lot. Eventually, my dad's fears were confirmed. The man kidnapped and raped a little girl the same age as me. Then, he came over to our part of the house and tried to come in. Luckily, me and my sister pretended we were not home. He's in jail now. It freaks me out thinking about it sometimes. Did you ever feel like you were being watched as a kid? Because in retrospect, I probably was. Had a client at the animal hospital where I worked who would bring in her sweetheart of a pit bull every couple of weeks for boarding. She always said she wanted to board for 3 to 4 days, and the poor dog always wound up staying close to 2 weeks. She spent half her life in our kennel, but we loved her and tried to keep her happy. One day, the lady comes in to pick up the dog, as usual more than 7 to 10 days later than she said she would, and that's the last time we saw her or the dog. About a week later, a couple of policemen come into the clinic asking when we last saw the woman, and the receptionists followed up by searching her name in Google. Turns out, she had murdered her boyfriend and gone on the run. It gets worse. Because she didn't do the dirty work herself, she manipulated their 13-year-old son into crushing his father's skull with a hammer while he slept, and then got him and their 16-year-old daughter to help her dismember the body and store it in a freezer in the basement. Then she left the kids in the house when she went fugitive. The police found her hiding under a bed at a relative's house. We never found out what happened to her dog, Sunshine. Met my cousin's cousins at a wedding when I was a kid. We got along instantly and had a lot of fun despite the boring wedding. Seemed like a perfectly normal kid. A couple of years later, he's in jail for kidnapping, raping, and murdering a girl he liked. Got caught trying to get rid of the body in the woods. A bloke I had known for years bought me a drink at the pub one night. About 5 hours later, he brutally murdered a woman with an axe. He had planned it for days and had the axe in his car at the pub prepared for his night ahead. Found out at 10 a.m. when the cops got him. I grew up with this kid. We were system kids, group homes, foster care, etc. We're like brothers. I have never met anyone who suffered more horrific abuse from more people than he did. And I grew up in child welfare, so that's saying something. This does not excuse him, but it does contextualize it. So, one day I'm sitting in juvie, and one of the coppers kicks my door. "Your partner's back, going to RMU." "For what?" "Read the paper tomorrow." He laughed and carried on. RMU was the equivalent of the SHU in juvie. You were almost always placed on it on intake for a homicide. I had assumed a robbery gone wrong. I had spoken to him the day before, told me he had a job for the night. Turned out, he had followed a woman off the bus, raped her in an alley for an hour, and slashed her throat. A good friend of mine's dad, who was really loaded, got caught making fake paintings from famous artists and selling them at auctions for a ton of money. He went to federal prison for 5 years and is now out and still really fucking rich. Shocker. When I was in high school, there was some real weird disturbed kid who posted on 4chan that he was planning on bombing our school at 11 a.m. on whatever certain date. Fortunately, he was caught before he was able to go through with anything. Guy's still in jail. Good. Strangely, I have 2 of these stories. I worked with a guy named Daniel Lee. He ended up being a twisted sick puke who raped and murdered a woman named Jenny Gray. His second victim, the little sister of my little brother's best friend, managed to get away. Not soon enough, though. About the same time, 88 to 90, I dated a girl whose sister was one of Ted Bundy's victims at the University of Florida. My dad used to rent the bottom half of his house out to random dudes so that he could afford his mortgage. One of them was really nice to me and my brother, and he ended up hanging himself downstairs while the rest of us were all in the living room. The guy after that was also really cool and funny, but he used to invite his girlfriend over and beat her up. One day, my dad was sick of his shit and fought him. The cops were called, and his roommate ended up going to jail. While he was in there, they matched his fingerprint to a cold case from years before. He is currently in prison for murder in the first degree. My best friend from high school was convicted on child porn charges a couple years ago. One time I was at his place and found his digital camera. We were in college at this point. There were dick pics on it. Didn't look closely because really didn't care to see. I assumed it was his because he was lonely and talking to girls online all the time. He tried to play it off as his cousin playing a prank on him. I look back on that now and realize what it was. The first weekend of November, when I was back home visiting Mom, one of my older brother's friends from high school popped around unexpected twice to say goodbye before he was to move interstate. This would be completely unnoteworthy if not for the following weekend when he went into a blind rage and killed his own father. He's currently being held until psych evaluations can be taken, so until April, when his murder trial begins. He'll either spend his time in prison or in a psych institution. It's unfortunate. He was a really lovely guy in high school, but turned to alcohol and later much harder drugs to repress the fact that his father used to molest and beat the 3 boys, possibly also his 2 sisters, when he was a kid. The drugs then exasperated the schizophrenia he had inherited from his father. We're not sure what made him snap or how he killed him, as they've released very few details in the week and a half since it happened. I imagine they won't release anything until the trial. Liked this girl in college. Always used to chat her up at the mall. She was gorgeous. We became friends over time, nothing serious. One day, her ex-boyfriend shows up and starts talking to her, so I give them some privacy. I knew the guy, but nothing really beyond his name. Someone else saw me walking away from them and said, "Oh my god, that's her ex. He's crazy. Never leave those 2 alone." I didn't think much of it at the time. I just thought that person was being melodramatic. But 6 months later, he kicked her apartment door in with a shotgun and murdered a guy she was on a date with. Then, he handcuffed her to a bed and raped her for several days before she convinced him to let her go. The last time I saw her, I went to the funeral to give her support. 20 years ago, my girlfriend's best friend boyfriend killed a dude. The dude had told the guy he was going to rape his girlfriend, and there was nothing he could do about it. Well, turns out he could, in fact, keep the guy from raping his girlfriend. He took him to the beach and shot him in the head. He went to jail, and I would guess is out by now. I had a friend who seemed a bit off to me when I met him from a mutual friend. We used to smoke weed, drink, etc. together. I don't know what the fuck happened, but he wound up 2 states over, standoff with the cops. He had a backpack, a gun, ammo in the backpack. He had a list of cops he wanted to kill. No idea how he even got their names. In the end, he was found. Incompetent, I guess is the word. Spent some time in an institution, got released. We tripped shrooms shortly after. He's doing okay now. My night guard, live-in dangerous place. He was always on time, always did patrols around the house. We always felt safe with him. One day, he stopped showing up and his manager was taking his shifts, so we asked him where he had gone. He said he had been arrested. They wouldn't tell us why for a few days. About a week later, we found out he had been sent to max prison for a lifetime sentence for raping an 8-year-old girl. I have an 8-year-old sister. To think that he had been on our property with my little sister around disgusts me. He had easy access to our house. Thank God he is locked away for life. I was dating this guy I'd met at work. He started staying at my place pretty frequently after about 3 months. One day, my boss, who was like family to me, called me and told me there was a sheriff at my workplace looking for my boyfriend. He apparently had a warrant for his arrest for violating his probation. I had no clue he was on probation, neither did my boss. Turns out, he had been previously charged with kidnapping and attempted murder of his ex-girlfriend. That was an abrupt ending to that relationship. I'm a cop. My first arrest was for this guy who stole a bag of potato chips from the corner store. He had a few open warrants too. He was overall very polite and nice and kind. very respectful to me and my training officer throughout the whole ordeal. Would see him periodically, time to time on patrol. He would always be courteous, say hello, and ask how I was doing. All really out of the ordinary behavior for a mid-20s black male in an impoverished urban environment, but it was a breath of fresh air. About 3 months later, after I arrested him, he broke into an apartment and stabbed an elderly man and his wife to death. In the process, he nearly decapitated the man. The elderly man was a crackhead, and the murderer was trying to collect a debt. My neighbor Dan seemed nice. At first, we got chatting because he had an English Bull Terrier and I had a Staffordshire Bull Terrier. Found out he also liked to smoke some weed, so over the next few months, had a few cups of tea while comparing smokables. Met his girlfriend Georgina, who was really nice and sweet, and also their young son. After a year or so, Dan would come to my place regularly after a while, and I got to know him quite well. That's when I realized something wasn't quite right. During our chats, he would get very intense whenever the subject of violence came up. One occasion, he threatened to slice his girlfriend up if she ever cheated. He was serious. I was shocked. He then went on to say he had done bird, jail time, and it didn't bother him. After that, I tried to distance myself from them and pretended to be out a lot. He seemed to go downhill quite quickly. I bumped into his girlfriend a few weeks later, and she told me he had a big cocaine habit and had dealers after him. She said he had weapons stashed around the apartment just in case. She also asked that if I ever heard a commotion, would I investigate, phone the police. I of course agreed, as she seemed genuinely scared for her and her son. About a week later, I was home watching TV when I heard noises coming from the hallway. I quickly went to investigate with 999 already dialed on my phone, only to be greeted by the police outside kicking Dan's door in. Turns out, Dan had attacked his girlfriend in a coke-fueled rage and bashed her head in with a mallet. I had a summer job in college where I was the only white guy there. The rest of the guys were Hispanic, legal and illegal combined, which made for good lunchtime banter. Well, they all loved me, and we got along great, so they decided to roll the dice, and 2 months into the job, and they hire another white guy. But from the first day, this guy did not seem right to me. Just got this vibe about him. The best way to describe it was when he looked at you and you made eye contact, then broke it, he stared at you for about 3 more seconds. Weird. Well, one day, he flies off the rails and shoots his wife in the head, then barricades himself in his apartment and has a 20-hour standoff with the police. He gives himself up, and now is in prison for life with no parole. Moral of the story is one white guy on the crew is all you need. There was a guy at my high school, we'll call him Barry. Barry was kind of off, but not the creepy loner type. He was into drugs, but not in a pothead way. He was doing pills and starting to get into harder stuff. Sophomore year of college, a very, very old friend of mine who had gotten into hard drugs was doing pills with Barry. My friend stopped breathing. Barry did nothing. His mother, at whose house they were, did nothing. By the time they ended up calling the paramedics, my friend was dead. One of the nicest, beat people I ever knew died while this guy watched. Years later, about 2 years ago, the cops get called out to Barry's house. He was threatening his fiancée with a knife. The cops show up. Barry comes out with a knife. He refuses to drop it, so the cops drop him. I try very hard to forgive people. I try very hard to move on and not let anger poison me. But I won't say that I don't feel a little bit of satisfaction. Like, the world is better off. I've never said good riddance, and I'm not saying it now, but yeah. He wasn't a friend or anything, but I did meet him. I get into a fender bender in downtown St. Louis in front of a police precinct, so cops just walked up to the scene. They take a report and run my name. Apparently I had a warrant for my arrest due to an unpaid Metro subway ticket. Funny story. I'm surprised when they put me in cuffs, as it eventually totaled all of $50. Anyway, I'm at a precinct before being transferred to a city jail holding tank. In the paddy wagon ride over, I'm next to a guy that's not saying a word, and some blokes who were trespassing somewhere. We get to the holding tank, which is a small cell with 30 plus people in it. The silent guy, who the other jailbirds dubbed OG, immediately walks to the toilet, takes a shit, and doesn't flush. It was so crowded, a few people were sitting on the cinder block dividing wall, and they start saying, OG, WTF, man? Still not a word from OG. About an hour later, OG is taken somewhere else, first to go. Another hour later, my $50 fine or bail is paid, and I'm free to go. Next day, I see OG's face in the news. Apparently, he had kidnapped 3 16-year-olds and had been pimping them out of his basement. Guy got 20 years. I only met the guy a few times in passing, but my husband grew up with him. He seemed normal. His father was a pastor of the church, and he ended up doing some work with kids. Turns out, he was sexually assaulting kids, and it finally came out. My husband and his friends were shocked. My husband wondered if it was true at first, but the more that came out, the more damning it got. He felt sick. So did our friends. This guy was a monster, and no one suspected he was doing this. There weren't any clues. He pled guilty to a lot of the charges and is in prison. One friend wanted to go and visit and demand answers, but I tried to explain he wasn't likely to hear what he wants. It really shook my husband to the core. We have 2 daughters, and he finds it hard to trust people. I'm very cautious too, but I have to remind him it is okay to let our kids interact with people while we're watching. He knows it, but he keeps an extra close eye on anyone who takes an interest in our kids because of this experience. My parents let my brother's high school friend crash at our house to get back on his feet. Nice guy, charismatic, had a very slight vibe of bad boy, but not much. He went to jail for something super lame, drugs or something. The day he was released, he went to his former best friend's house, did not ask for money, but beat him over the head with a bathroom scale and tried to suffocate his mother, who had taken this kid in during high school and treated him like her own son with a plastic bag. He had been at my wedding. Another guy I went to high school with went out drinking with a buddy in a college town, were last seen arguing and broken up by security guards. And 2 days later, his buddy is found drowned in the river with his hat on the shoreline. The alive guy, in the intervening time, had gone back home, gotten an attorney, and would not talk to anyone. That one is pretty obvious, but with no evidence other than a drowned body, he's living his life as a free man. Also, my former father-in-law worked on getting my mother-in-law back into a relationship for 2 years, and 6 months after they moved in together, he had her sell all of her possessions and change her life insurance policy to having him as the sole beneficiary. 3 months later, she was dead of a significant amount of pills and gaping head wound. However, he fed her too many pills for it to look like an accidental overdose or fall, and it was written off as a suicide, so we got nothing. He's now in jail for probably the rest of his natural life for another scheme where he took advantage of an elderly woman to the tune of $20,000 plus before the woman's family intervened.